A ladder leans against a bronze gate in Constantinople. It is the year 726, and the gate is the chalk, the ceremonial entrance to the great palace, roofed in gilded bronze tiles that catch the morning light off the Sea of Marmara. Above the doors hangs an image of Christ, golden, enormous, the most visible icon in the most powerful Christian city on earth. An imperial officer climbs the ladder. He has orders from the emperor himself, Leo III, to take the image down and replace it with a plain cross. And as he reaches for the face of Christ, a crowd gathers below him, mostly women according to the accounts. They shake the ladder. He falls. By the time the story reaches us, the officer is dead, killed by the mob at the foot of the gate, and the first executions of the iconoclast era have begun. A war over images has started inside the church, and it will run, on and off, for 117 years. Bishops will anathematize bishops. Monks will be scourged and branded. 2 church councils will each claim to speak for God, and each condemn the other as heretics. But before we go one step further, I have to tell you something about that scene at the gate. Something most videos on this subject will not tell you. It may never have happened. The earliest accounts of the Chalk Gate incident were written decades after the fact, by the side that eventually won. And several leading Byzantine historians today, Leslie Brubaker and John Heldon chief among them, argue the whole episode was constructed later as an origin story. The evidence for a famous icon over that gate before the 8th century is surprisingly thin. Even the opening scene of this war is disputed, and that detail is not a footnote. It is a warning about everything that follows, because nearly all of what we know about iconoclasm was written by its enemies. So this video is going to do something harder than picking a side. We are going to walk through what the evidence actually shows, from the catacombs to the councils, and I am going to be honest with you about where each tradition's favorite version of this story breaks down. Because underneath the broken statues and the burned paintings sits one question that Christians have never stopped answering, and here is the claim I want to plant now and prove by the end. This war was never about art. It was about a body. 2 piles of evidence start where every honest historian has to start, with the awkward fact that the early church left behind 2 piles of evidence, and they point in opposite directions. The first pile is made of words, and the words are, almost without exception, hostile to images. Clement of Alexandria, writing around the year 200, declared flatly that works of art cannot be sacred and divine. Tertullian, his North African contemporary, was so rigorous he questioned whether a Christian could even work as an artist, arguing that the second commandment interdicted all likenesses. Origen boasted that Christians, taught in the school of Christ, had rejected all images and statues and would rather die than debase their conception of God with them. Then a council put it in writing. Around the year 305, bishops gathered at Elvira in Spain and produced Canon 36. Pictures are not to be placed in churches, so that they do not become objects of worship and adoration. The exact date and precise meaning of that canon are debated by scholars, and I want to flag that clearly. But the plain sense is hard to escape. A church council, before Constantine, telling Christians to keep pictures off the walls of their worship spaces. 2 more voices, and both come with an asterisk. Eusebius of Caesarea, the first great church historian, reportedly received a letter from Constantia, the emperor's sister, asking for a picture of Christ. His reply survives in fragments. Had she forgotten the commandment against making a likeness of anything in heaven above or the earth beneath? The asterisk is this. That letter comes down to us mainly because iconoclasts quoted it at their own council 4 centuries later, and some scholars question whether Eusebius wrote all of it. Disputed, labeled as such, and Epiphanius of Salamis, who died in 403. In a letter preserved by Jerome, he describes walking into a village church, finding a curtain embroidered with an image of Christ or a saint, and tearing it down on the spot, calling such images contrary to our religion. Orthodox scholars have long argued this passage was forged and inserted later. Many historians accept it. Again, disputed, and you deserve to know that rather than have it quoted at you as a closed case. So, there is the first pile. If all you had were the texts, you would conclude the early church was firmly, even fiercely opposed to religious images. Then you pick up a shovel. What the walls say in 1932. Archaeologists excavating a garrison town on the Euphrates River, a place called Dura-Europos, uncovered an ordinary house that had been quietly renovated around the year 240. A wall knocked out to make an assembly hall, a side room fitted with a plastered tub under a canopy. It was a church, the oldest church building ever found, and the baptistry walls were covered in paintings, Christ as the Good Shepherd painted directly above the font, Christ healing the paralytic, Christ and Peter walking on the water, women approaching a tomb at dawn. This congregation existed while Christians were still being executed for their faith, a full lifetime before Constantine. In the same generation that Origen was writing that Christians reject all images, and they baptize their converts surrounded by pictures of Jesus, Rome tells the same story underground. In the catacombs along the Via Salaria and the Appian Way, 3rd century Christians buried their dead beneath ceilings painted with the Good Shepherd, with praying figures, with Jonah under his vine, with what appears to be the earliest surviving image of Mary with the infant Christ in the catacomb of Priscilla. Roughly 150 separate shepherd images survive in the Roman catacombs alone. Hold both piles in your mind at once. The pamphlets say no images. The walls are covered with them. What do we do with that? Here is my first honest opinion of this video, and it will irritate both sides. The popular Protestant claim that the early church was purely aniconic and images are simply a pagan infection does not survive the archaeology. Christians were painting Christ within a century of the apostles, in their churches and over their graves, and nobody at Dura seems to have torn the plaster down. But the popular Orthodox and Catholic counterclaim fails its own test too. Pictures on a wall are not proof of veneration. Nothing at Dura or Priscilla shows anyone kissing these images, burning incense before them, or praying through them, and the practice of venerating portable panel icons that later Byzantium took for granted is very hard to document before the 6th century. The early church made images. The early church, as far as our evidence reaches, did not venerate them the way later centuries would. Both modern camps are reading their own habits backwards into the catacombs. The historical picture sits uncomfortably in between, and the discomfort is the truth. Notice something else, though, something almost nobody points out. The argument happened in paint before it happened in text. For 400 years, no one wrote a serious theology of images, for or against. Christians simply painted, and the minority of theologians simply objected, and the two activities ran on parallel tracks. It took an empire to force the collision. The snake Moses made before we watch the empire choose sides. We have to go back further than the catacombs, because both sides of this war drew their weapons from the same armory, the Hebrew Scriptures. And what almost no one admits is that the armory itself is divided. The iconoclast case begins at Sinai. Exodus 20 verse 4 could hardly be blunter. You shall not make for yourself an image in the form of anything in heaven above, or on the earth beneath, or in the waters below. You shall not bow down to them. Israel's whole identity was carved against the image-making nations around her, and the prophets never tired of mocking the man who cuts down a tree, burns half for warmth, and bows to the other half. Except the same God who spoke Sinai's ban also commissioned images. 5 chapters later, in Exodus 25 verse 18, he commands Moses to hammer 2 golden cherubim and mount them over the ark in the holiest cubic meter on the planet. Solomon's temple, built with divine approval, swarmed with carved cherubim, palm trees, open flowers, and 12 bronze oxen holding up the great basin. Whatever the second commandment forbids, it evidently does not forbid all religious imagery, because God ordered some. Then comes the story that contains this entire video in miniature, and I am convinced it is the most underused passage in the whole debate. In Numbers 21 verse 8, Israel is dying of snakebite in the desert, and God tells Moses to make an image, a bronze serpent on a pole. Whoever looks at it lives, a God-commanded, life-giving, salvation-carrying image, and centuries later Jesus himself uses it as a picture of his own crucifixion in John 3 verse 14. Now read what happened to that serpent. In 2 Kings 18 verse 4, King Hezekiah smashes it to pieces, and the writer praises him for it. Why? Because the Israelites had been burning incense to it. They even gave it a pet name, Nehushtan. The same object was a gift from God in one century, and an idol in another, and the difference was never in the bronze. It was in the people kneeling in front of it. Hold that story because it is the whole controversy compressed. The iconodule points at the serpent's creation. God is clearly not against images as such. The iconoclast points at its destruction. And this is what always happens to them. Both are reading the text correctly. The scriptures themselves hand us an image commanded, an image corrupted, and an image destroyed, and then leave us to argue about which chapter of that story we are living in. The 8th century was, in a sense, one long fight over whether Byzantium had reached the Hezekiah chapter. The road to the bonfire after Constantine legalized the faith in 313, the pictures came out of the ground. Basilicas rose with mosaic Christs blazing in their apses. By the 6th century, something new appears in the record. Icons credited with miracles, icons said to be made without human hands, icons carried around city walls when armies approached. The image of Christ was no longer decoration. In the popular mind it had become presence, protection, power. Two legends show how far the devotion had traveled, and I am calling them legends deliberately. The first claimed that the evangelist Luke had painted the original portrait of Mary from life, which would make icon-making an apostolic practice. The second told of the Mandelion of Edessa, a cloth bearing the face of Christ, imprinted not by any painter but by Christ himself, an image not made by human hands. Neither story can be traced anywhere near the 1st century. Both emerge in the mists of later piety, but their popularity tells you what people needed to believe. By the 6th century, defenders of images were already reaching backward for an unbroken chain to the apostles, which is itself evidence that the chain was not obviously there. The anxiety grew right alongside the devotion. In 692, a council in Constantinople known as the Quinisext ruled that Christ should be depicted in his human form rather than symbolically as a lamb, an early sign that the empire now considered images a matter for legislation. Some bishops in Asia Minor went the other direction entirely and began preaching against the veneration of images as idolatry, straight from Exodus 20 verse 4. Then the world caved in. Within a single lifetime, the armies of Islam, a faith with its own deep suspicion of religious images, tore away Syria, Palestine, Egypt and North Africa, and twice besieged Constantinople itself. Around 721, only a few years before Leo moved, the Caliph Yazid II reportedly ordered Christian images destroyed throughout his territories. And some historians have argued that Byzantine iconoclasm was partly an anxious imitation of the empire's most successful enemy, a suspicion the iconophiles weaponized by sneering that Leo had a Saracen mind. How much Islam actually shaped Leo's thinking remains debated. The bishops of Asia Minor were reaching the same conclusions from their own Bibles. Mark that one disputed too. A volcanic eruption at Thera around 726 darkened the sky over the Aegean. To Leo III, a soldier emperor from the eastern frontier, the arithmetic of catastrophe pointed one direction. God was angry, and the most visible candidate for his anger was the empire's habit of bowing to painted boards. Leo reportedly called icon veneration a craft of idolatry, and in 730 he issued his edict against the images and deposed Germanos, the Patriarch of Constantinople, who refused to sign it. One caution before we watch the fires. Later iconophile writers describe a holocaust of art and a persecution of savage cruelty, and modern scholarship has shown that much of this was exaggerated by the winners. Images demonstrably survived the period. Some destruction happened, how much is disputed. History written by victors cuts both ways, and this time the victors loved icons. The monk behind enemy lines, the greatest defender of icons, could not be touched by the emperor, and the reason is one of the strangest ironies in church history. John of Damascus, born around 675, lived his entire life under Muslim rule. He served in the administration of the caliph in Damascus before becoming a monk near Jerusalem. When he wrote his 3 treatises against those who attack the divine images, he was, in effect, defending Christian icons from inside the Islamic Caliphate, beyond the reach of the Christian emperor, who wanted them destroyed. John conceded the obvious immediately. God in his own nature cannot be depicted. He is invisible, immaterial, without shape or boundary. To paint the divine essence would be both blasphemy and nonsense. So far, he and the iconoclasts agree completely. Then he turns, and the entire controversy pivots on one sentence. When the invisible one becomes visible in flesh, he says, "Then you may draw a likeness of his form." Something happened at Bethlehem, John argues, that rewrote the rules of representation. The God who could not be seen took a body that could be. He had a face. The face cast shadows, and a face that casts shadows can be drawn. His most famous line deserves to be heard in full, because it is the closest thing the whole controversy has to a thesis statement. "I do not venerate matter," John wrote. "I venerate the fashioner of matter, who became matter for my sake, and accepted to dwell in matter, and through matter worked my salvation." Now for the word underneath the war, because this whole conflict compresses into a single piece of Greek. The verb is perigraphian, peri meaning around, and graphian meaning to draw, or write, to circumscribe, to draw a line around something. The iconoclasts insisted that God is aperigraptos, uncircumscribable, a being no line can close around, and therefore every icon of Christ is a lie drawn in paint. The iconodules answered that in the Incarnation, the uncircumscribable God voluntarily accepted circumscription. Mary's womb drew a line around him, the manger drew a line around him, the tomb drew a line around him. An icon, they argued, only traces a line God himself had already chosen to live inside. Every anathema, every exile, Every broken mosaic in this story is an argument about that one verb. Can you draw a line around God? The iconoclasts said never. The iconodules said he drew it first. The best argument, nobody answers Leo's son, Constantine V. Ruled from 741 to 775, and he was no thug with a hammer. He was arguably the most theologically literate emperor Byzantium ever produced, author of 13 treatises against the images. In 754, he convened a council at Hieria, attended by more than 330 bishops, which declared itself the Seventh Ecumenical Council and condemned icon veneration as blasphemy. Set aside the political stage management and listen to the actual argument, because it is formidable. Christ, the council reasoned, is one person in two natures, fully God and fully man. Now paint him. What exactly have you painted? If you claim your paint captures him, you have circumscribed his divine nature, which is impossible, and you have confused the natures like the Monophysites. If you admit you painted only his humanity, you have peeled the manhood away from the Godhead and depicted a mere creature, splitting Christ like the Nestorians. Either way, the icon painter stumbles into a heresy the Church spent 4 councils condemning. The only true image of Christ, Hieraria concluded, is the one he gave us himself, the bread and wine of the Eucharist. Here is my second opinion, and I hold it as someone unconvinced by iconoclasm. That dilemma was the single best argument produced by either side in the entire controversy, and it deserves better than the sneering it usually receives. The iconoclasts were not Philistines who hated beauty. They were men terrified of idolatry, armed with the second commandment, and a rigorous Christology, watching an empire kiss wooden boards while its province is burned. If you have never felt the force of their case, you have not understood the fight. The answer, when it came, did not dodge the dilemma so much as expose its hidden assumption. An image, the iconodule theologians replied, does not claim identity with its subject, and never did. A portrait of Peter does not contain Peter's soul, and no one ever thought it must. An icon of Christ depicts his person, the concrete someone whom the disciples saw, not an extraction of either nature. The dilemma only works if a picture is a definition. It is not. It is a likeness, and likeness is precisely what the Incarnation put on the table. The Council of the Kissed Image Constantine V died on campaign. His grandson's regent, the Empress Irene, was an iconophile, and in 787 she assembled roughly 350 churchmen at Nicaea, the same city that hosted the First Great Council, to bury Hiera's decrees. This gathering, the Second Council of Nicaea, became the seventh and final council that Orthodox, Catholic, and some Protestant communions all technically recognize. Nicaea drew the distinction the whole conflict had been groping toward, and it drew it in Greek. To images belongs proskonesis, a bow of honor, the reverence a subject might pay an emperor's seal or a child might pay a parent's portrait. To God alone belongs latreia, absolute worship, the total offering of the self. Honor an icon, the council said, and the honor does not stop at the wood. It passes through to the prototype. Whoever venerates the image venerates the person depicted in it. Let me make that concrete, because the logic is more familiar than the vocabulary. Somewhere in your house is a photograph of someone you love who has died. If you have ever touched that photograph, or kept it in a wallet through years, when everything else was thrown away, you were not honoring paper and ink, and you know it. Now invert it. Imagine a stranger snatching that photograph and grinding it under his heel. Chemically he damaged pigment on paper, but you would feel it as contempt for her because the insult, like the honor, passes through the object to the person. That intuition, that images are transparent windows through which love and contempt both travel, is the entire argument of Nicaea in a single household object. And yet the story refuses to end cleanly, because the objections came immediately and not from pagans. Charlemagne's theologians in the West received a badly translated copy of the Council's Acts, one that made the Greeks appear to give images the same adoration given to the Trinity, and they responded with furious treatises. Their outrage rested partly on that translation blunder, but their sharpest thinker, Theodulf of Orleans, understood the distinction between veneration and worship perfectly well, and objected anyway, on the grounds that ordinary believers cross that line without noticing. Keep the images for teaching and beauty, the Franks essentially said. Just do not bow. Third opinion then, and it cuts against my second. The distinction between proskinesis and latreia is real, coherent, and ancient. The person who says veneration simply equals worship is refusing to read. But the Frankish worry was not stupid, and honesty requires admitting it. A theological distinction that holds up in a council chamber can smear in a candlelit village where a farmer is convinced. One particular icon heals, and the one in the next parish does not. Nicaea answered the question of principle. It could not, and did not, police the question of practice. Every tradition since has lived somewhere inside that gap. Relapse, and the woman who ended it. The peace lasted 28 years. In 815, another soldier emperor, Leo V, surveyed the empire's fresh defeats, concluded that the iconoclast emperors had won more battles, and restored the ban. The second iconoclasm was leaner and less bloody than the first, but it produced the movement's greatest confessor. Theodore, abbot of the Studios monastery in Constantinople, born 759, answered the new ban by leading his monks in open procession around the monastery on Palm Sunday. Icons lifted high where the whole city could see them. For that, and for the letter-writing campaign he ran from confinement, he was flogged, imprisoned, and exiled repeatedly until his death in 1826. His treatises refined the incarnational argument to its sharpest edge. The end, when it came again through an empress. Theophilos, the last iconoclast emperor, died in 842, leaving a 2-year-old heir and a widow, Theodora, who had reportedly kept icons privately all along. Within months, the iconoclast patriarch was deposed. Methodios, who had endured years of imprisonment for the images, was installed in his place, and a council quietly reaffirmed Nicaea. On the 11th of March 843, the first Sunday of Lent, Theodora, her small son, the patriarch, and a river of monks and clergy processed through Constantinople to Hagia Sophia and set the icons back in their places. The Orthodox Church still celebrates that day every first Sunday of Lent as the triumph of orthodoxy. Not the triumph over Arius, not the triumph over Rome. Of all the battles in its history, the Eastern Church chose this one, the war over images, as the fight that defines what orthodoxy means. The question in your architecture, you might think a controversy settled in 843 would stay settled. It lasted 7 centuries. Then men with ladders climbed toward images again, this time in Zurich and Geneva and the Kirks of Scotland, and whitewash went over the medieval saints by the acre. In 1524, the city of Zurich, under Zwingli's preaching, stripped its churches in an orderly official purge. Elsewhere the stripping was a mob with axes. Calvin knew the Byzantine debate, engaged Nicaea's arguments directly, and found the distinction between veneration and worship unconvincing in practice, essentially the Frankish objection reborn with a French accent, and the Reformation itself split along the old fault line, which is the detail most retellings skip. Luther, who had every chance to join the image breakers, refused. Pictures, he argued, are neither commanded nor forbidden. Smashing them just builds a new legalism out of bare walls. Within one generation of protest against Rome, Protestants were disagreeing with each other about images almost exactly as Constantinople, and the Franks once had. The 8th century's war became the 16th century's war, and its fault lines are the ones Christians still live on. Walk into an Orthodox church, a Catholic parish, and a Reformed chapel this Sunday, and you will see 3 different answers to Leo's edict, poured in plaster and glass. So pull the camera all the way back, because across 2,000 years the pattern finally becomes visible. A faith born inside Israel's horror of idols, whose scriptures open the law with a ban on graven images, somehow produced the most image-saturated civilization in human history. That is not hypocrisy. That is the shockwave of a single claim moving through the centuries, the claim of Paul in Colossians 1 verse 15, that Christ is the icon of the invisible God. Icon, the ordinary Greek word for a portrait, a statue, the emperor's face stamped on a coin. The apostolic writings dare to say that the unseeable God has an image, and the image is a living man. Every side of this war was wrestling with that sentence. The iconoclast heard it and said, God has already chosen his one image, Christ himself, and bread and wine are the only copy he authorized. Your paintings are trespass. The iconodules heard it and said, if God took a face, then faces can now carry glory, and matter itself has been conscripted into salvation. 2 readings of one verse, and an empire bled over the difference, which is why I told you at the beginning what I will say again now, word for word. This war was never about art. It was about a body. Whether God really took one, what it changed that he did, and how close he is willing to let matter, wood, paint, bread, flesh, come to his own holiness. The 8th century answered with councils and exiles. You answer it every time you decide what belongs on the wall of the place, where you pray, whether the physical world is a ladder to God or a distraction from him. Christians of goodwill still land in different places, and after walking through the evidence, you can see why. Here is what I would leave you with. The next time you stand in a church, any church, look at the walls. Bare or blazing, they are not neutral. They They are a 7-word confession of how that congregation reads the Incarnation, still being argued in plaster 12 centuries after a ladder leaned against a bronze gate. If this walk through the war over images sharpened that question for you, pass this video to someone from a tradition whose walls look nothing like yours and ask them what their walls are saying. The conversation that follows is the one the Church has been having for 2,000 years. It deserves better than a hammer and better than a shrug.